The silence in the military trauma ward shattered. Not by an alarm, but by 3 shadows emerging from an elevator at 2 a.m. Their suits were too sharp, their purpose too cold. A nurse, quiet as river ice, saw them coming. But would anyone believe her secret identity before the real battle began? The pervasive quiet of the Apex Veterans Medical Center at 2 in the morning was not true silence. True silence, a void, never existed in places dedicated to the fight for life. Instead, it was a precise symphony of mechanical survival. The rhythmic sigh of ventilators, the distant, dull thud of a cart rolling down a tiled corridor, the steady percussion of cardiac monitors measuring frail human resilience. Here, on the 3rd floor, in the military trauma unit, men and women battled wars that had ended years ago, their bodies present in a heartland city, their minds still entangled in distant dust and echoing gunfire. Elara Thorne moved through this landscape like a ghost, or perhaps like a guardian. At 42, her presence was understated, almost unseen, until needed. Beneath the loose scrubs, an athletic frame, honed by a forgotten past, was barely discernible. Her sandy blonde hair, streaked with silver she refused to hide, was pulled into a tight bun, meticulously secured. It was her eyes that told the story, if one knew how to read them. Pale gray-green, the color of winter ice, they absorbed every detail and betrayed nothing. They held the stillness of a predator waiting, the patience of someone who had once spent 3 days in a hidden observation post, watching patterns in enemy movements that trained intelligence analysts had missed for months. Dr. Eris Vance, the attending physician, once remarked that Elara possessed the instincts of a trauma surgeon trapped in a nurse's body. It was meant as a compliment, a recognition of her uncanny ability to catch the subtle shifts, a patient's fading color, an erratic blip on a monitor, the shallowing breath that heralded a crisis. Vance had no idea how profoundly right that assessment truly was. Tonight was Ilara's usual Tuesday, a night shift, like every other night shift she worked, a schedule that suited the deeper rhythms of her own solitary existence. 6 years she'd been here, turning down promotions, always the same answer. "I'm better at the bedside." What remained unsaid: leadership means caring. Caring means losing. She had lost enough. The unit held 16 souls tonight. Sergeant Major Reese in 302, recovering from his 4th spinal fusion. Staff Sergeant Lee in 307, his mind a fractured map after an IED in a forgotten city, unable to recall his wife's name, but capable of reciting his unit's battle roster from memory. And Private First Class Miller in 311, just 22, with the vacant eyes of a man twice his age, both legs gone below the knee, his anger a palpable shroud that made other nurses shrink away. Elara took Miller. She always took the ones nobody else wanted. At 11:30 p.m., she checked Miller's vitals. Stable blood pressure, pain managed, the raw stumps of his legs healing, despite his stubborn refusal to engage with physical therapy. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Can't do much of anything," he muttered, the bitterness a metallic taste in the sterile air. His physical therapy would resume at 8 a.m., the fittings for his prosthetics later that week. "What's the point?" he asked, the words edged with despair. Elara adjusted his IV, her scarred hands moving with the precision of a clockmaker. The small, deliberate scars across her knuckles spoke of a past buried so deep, sometimes even she forgot it wasn't another person's life. "The point," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "is that you survived something that kills most people. That means you've got business still left to finish." He truly looked at her then, the way patients sometimes did when she spoke not from a textbook, but from somewhere deeper. "Were you in?" he asked. "I was somewhere," she replied, her universal answer. She finished her rounds at 12:15 a.m., returning to the glowing patient assignment board at the nurse's station. She had seen the name when she clocked in. Her body registered it instantly. A tripwire pulled, followed by total avoidance. Room 314. Vance, Elias, Colonel retired. Post-cardiac surgery, triple bypass. Transferred from the major military medical center nearby. Her father. 15 years of silence stretched between them, since the morning she shipped out for her third deployment to a distant, dusty land, and he had looked at his only child, saying, "Let me know when you're ready to be a real soldier." She had proven him wrong 100 times over, in places whose names she could never speak aloud, earning commendations she couldn't display, and the respect of every special operator in the Joint Command. But she'd never proven it to him. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped trying. For 3 days, Ilara had traded shifts, avoiding room 314. But tonight, Nurse Lena, the unit's only other night nurse, had called in sick. Ilara was alone. 16 patients, including him. She stared at the board, feeling a cold certainty she hadn't felt since her last deployment, a chilling premonition that tonight would change everything. Room 314 smelled like every military hospital room Ilara had ever inhabited, antiseptic, institutional soap with the faint metallic tang of surgical recovery. The cardiac monitor offered its steady, familiar rhythm. Colonel Elias Vance looked a decade older than the man etched in her memory. Now 78, he had once been 53, straight-backed, iron-jawed, the kind of officer who commanded respect with his mere presence. 3 tours in a distant jungle war, commendations for valor, wounded twice, 30 years of infantry service that left his body scarred with shrapnel, his soul calibrated by the harsh metrics of conflict. He was thinner now, his hair completely white. The surgical dressing across his chest spoke of his bypass, wires and leads making him appear fragile in a way she had never conceived. Ilara entered, masked, gloved, chart in hand, her voice professionally neutral. "Good evening, Colonel. I need to check your vitals." He was awake, of course. Elias Vance had never truly slept in a place he didn't control. His eyes, though clouded by post-surgical haze and medication, tracked her with the sharp assessment of a career infantry officer. "Another nurse," he rasped, not unkindly, but with the dismissive tone of a man accustomed to anonymity from those who served him. "The last one couldn't even take a proper blood pressure. You'd think a facility dedicated to service would have staff who understand basic discipline." "This is a civilian hospital, Colonel. The staff here are very capable." She checked his blood pressure, 138/86, slightly elevated but acceptable. Heart rate 74, steady. Oxygen saturation 97%. She documented everything with the meticulous precision of a woman who once filed intelligence reports that went directly to the highest levels of command. What would you do in this silence, listening to the casual, unintentional cruelty of a man who formed your very foundation? "You know," Vance continued, staring at the ceiling, "my daughter was in the military, or so she claimed." He spoke to the room, as if the world owed him an audience. "Joined the Marines instead of doing something real. Couldn't hack it, apparently. Haven't heard from her in years." Ilara's pen paused, a microsecond of stillness, the silence stretching like a tripwire. "Maybe she had her reasons," she said. Vance looked at her then, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Not recognition, not yet, but an uneasy sense that the conversational terrain had subtly shifted. "Reasons?" he repeated. "Everyone has reasons. My father stormed the beaches. I served 3 tours. Our family has an army tradition that goes back generations, and she chose the Marines." He almost spat the word. Ilara finished recording his vitals and closed the chart. Her hands remained steady, her voice level. Every fiber of her being remained operational, just as she had been trained by the United States Marine Corps, to function under conditions that would shatter most humans. Her father's casual dismissal barely registered on that scale. "Your vitals are stable, Colonel. Someone will check on you in 2 hours." She reached the door before he called out, "Nurse!" She stopped, not turning. "Have any of you people actually served? It would be nice to talk to someone who understands." Ilara's left hand gripped the doorframe, a small scar bisecting her left eyebrow, shrapnel from a forgotten city in 2004, which she told curious co-workers was from a childhood bicycle accident, caught the fluorescent light. "We all serve in different ways, Colonel." The door closed behind her with the quiet finality of a conversation that had waited 15 years to not happen. At the nurse's station, she pressed both palms flat against the desk. An invisible tremor coursed through her, unseen by anyone else, but profoundly felt by her. She hated it. The last time her hands had trembled was during an extraction in a desert canyon, holding 2 dying Marines, listening to their breathing slow, powerless. That was the night her career had ended. This, she knew, was the night something else would end. But what Ilara didn't know, what no one in the hospital knew, was that 3 men were already en route to the Apex Veterans Medical Center. They carried forged federal credentials, suppressed weapons, and explicit orders to ensure Colonel Elias Vance never testified before the regulatory body about a pharmaceutical company called OmniPharma Industries. And they possessed intelligence files on every staff member in the military trauma unit. Every staff member, that is, except one. The hours between midnight and 3 a.m. belonged to the ghosts. Ilara knew this from 18 years of operating in the dark. Not the metaphorical dark of emotional hardship, but the actual operational dark, where survival meant moving through hostile territory by starlight and instinct, fueled by absolute faith in one's training. She had learned to see in the dark as others learned to read, completely, thoroughly, until it became an extension of who she was. The irony was stark. She had spent the first half of her adult life moving through darkness to find the enemy. Now she spent the second half moving through darkness to find a pulse. In this unit, the ghosts were gentler, yet no less persistent. Sergeant Major Reese called out for his wife in his sleep. Staff Sergeant Lee woke twice, disoriented, asking Ilara if they'd reached the extraction point. She told him yes, they had, and he drifted back to sleep with the relief of a man who'd been waiting years for that answer. She moved through each room with the practiced efficiency of a nurse who knew her patients' rhythms better than they did their own. Blood pressure checks, pain medication adjustments, the small, essential acts of care that kept 16 human beings tethered to life through the deepest hours. But she kept circling back to room 314, like a reconnaissance operator returning to an observation point, not out of desire, but because the mission required it. At 1:15 a.m., his cardiac monitor alarmed. Not a crisis, merely a brief atrial fibrillation episode that resolved itself in seconds. But it required documentation, a reason to re-enter. Vance was awake again, this time with a sharpness that cut through the post-surgical haze. He was looking at a folder on his bedside table. Even from the doorway, Ilara could discern the OmniPharma Industries letterhead. Cardiac rhythm showed a brief irregularity, she stated, crossing to the monitor. It's self-corrected. I'm going to document it and notify the attending. I'm fine, Vance said, his voice strained. I've got bigger problems than a skipped heartbeat. Ilara adjusted his leads, checked the monitor's history. The episode lasted 3 seconds. Nothing to panic about, but everything to watch in a patient 6 days post-triple bypass. Is there anything you need, Colonel? He was quiet for a moment. Then, do you know what OmniPharma Industries is? Ilara waited. Pharmaceutical company. They make a drug called Cardex, a cardiac medication. They pushed it through FDA approval with falsified safety data and bribed reviewers. It's being prescribed to veterans through the VA system. His jaw tightened. 23 men and women have died. 23 veterans. The death toll will be in the hundreds if someone doesn't stop them. Ilara said nothing, listening not just to the words, but to the tension in his breathing, the white-knuckled grip on the folder. This was not a man rambling from medication. This was a man carrying intelligence. I was supposed to testify before the regulatory body, he continued. Video conference from this bed in about 5 hours. I have documentation, proof, internal memos, trial data, everything. That sounds important. Important enough that someone tried to have me killed 3 weeks ago. The heart attack. I was reviewing documents when it happened. I thought it was stress, but my cardiologist found something in my blood work that shouldn't have been there. Something that could have been introduced into my medication. The room felt different now. Ilara's senses had shifted, the hyper-awareness of threat assessment engaging after 6 years. Sounds became data points, shadows, potential cover. Every entrance and exit, a tactical consideration. Have you told anyone else? She asked. The federal investigators have my documentation. But I'm the witness. Without my testimony, it's just paper. Deniable. Discreditable. He looked at her with something that might have been desperation in a man who rarely allowed himself such a luxury. I need to make it to 7 a.m. That's when the testimony starts. Can you make sure I stay alive until then? Ilara met his eyes, pale gray-green meeting faded blue. Father and daughter, separated by 15 years of silence, connected by a question neither fully understood. That's my job, Colonel. She left the room, closing the door behind her. In the hallway, she stood perfectly still for 10 seconds, the precise length of time it takes to transition from one operational mode to another, from nurse to something else entirely. Then she did something she hadn't done in 6 years. She pulled out her personal cell phone, not the hospital-issued device, but the one with the encrypted messaging app she'd never deleted. The one linked to a contact list that included some of the most dangerous and capable individuals in the nation's military. She sent one message. Vance testimony. Credible threats status. The reply came in 90 seconds from a contact listed only as actual confirmed. FBI investigation active. OmniPharma has contracted private security to prevent testimony. Hospital security deemed insufficient. Protect the asset. Ilara read the message twice. Then she deleted the conversation, pocketed the phone. The past she had buried was calling. Ilara walked to the supply closet at the end of the hall. She knew its contents with an almost surgical precision, a habit ingrained from 18 years of assessing resources in hostile environments. Tonight, that habit was not merely professional diligence, it was survival instinct. She was no longer just Ilara Thorne, night shift RN, the quiet one who worked every holiday because she had nowhere else to be. She was Cipher, Master Sergeant Ilara Thorne, 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, United States Marine Corps. 18 years of combat operations, 6 deployments, commendations she'd never shown anyone. skills that could fill classified performance reviews. Her mission was clear: keep a federal witness alive until 7 a.m. Her assessment of the environment was swift, clinical, devoid of emotion. 16 patients, most combat veterans who would respond to authority and clear instructions. One security station on the first floor, manned by retired military personnel who understood a code silver. 2 stairwells, 1 elevator bank, 1 service corridor with exterior access on the east side. The east corridor's camera, she recalled, had been malfunctioning for 3 days. She had reported it herself. Now a cold certainty settled. The malfunction was deliberate. He was a principal to protect, and she would protect him with everything she had, even if he had spent 15 years believing she was nothing. The air in the ward felt different. What had been a sanctuary for healing now felt like a thinly veiled staging ground. The quiet hum of the machines, once comforting, now vibrated with an unspoken tension. Every distant sound, every shift in shadow was amplified, processed, evaluated. Ilara felt the familiar cold fire in her gut, the hyper-awareness that signaled the transition from civilian life to operational reality. It was a familiar, unwelcome comfort. At 2:31 a.m., Ilara was at the nurse's station, reviewing Vance's chart, when the elevator chimed at the end of the corridor. The sound was wrong. Not the elevator itself, but the timing. Visitor hours ended at 9 p.m. Staff shift changes happened at 7 a.m. and 11 p.m. Deliveries came through the loading dock, not the public elevator. At 2:31 a.m., nothing came up that elevator unless it was a code blue response team or a patient transfer, and both would have been preceded by a call. Ilara didn't look up from the chart. She didn't need to. The security camera feed, a small monitor to her left, showed the corridor. She had positioned herself at this station 6 years ago, specifically because it gave her a sight line to both corridor approaches and the elevator bank. 3 men, professional posture, matching dark suits, credentials appearing to be U.S. Marshals visible on their belts. They walked with purpose, not the hurried purpose of law enforcement on an urgent mission, but the controlled purpose of an assault team moving to a target. Their spacing was tight, too tight for law enforcement who walked in pairs or loose formations. These men moved in a military stack: lead, follow, rear security. It was the kind of formation learned in special operations and never quite unlearned. Ilara's pulse didn't change. Her breathing didn't falter. 6 years of civilian nursing fell away like water off a diving suit, revealing the woman who had operated behind enemy lines in 6 countries, who had decoded insurgent networks that stumped intelligence agencies, who had earned the call sign Cipher because she could read anyone's code while remaining impossible to read herself. She read them in 4 seconds. The lead man, mid-40s, 6 feet, 200 pounds, carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had once worn a uniform. His suit was well-tailored but functional, the jacket cut to conceal a shoulder holster. His credentials looked perfect. His hands, however, told a different story. Shooter's calluses on his trigger finger, but his holster was positioned too high on his belt, a display position, not a draw position. A real marshal's weapon sat lower, angled for a smooth draw. This man had positioned his to look authentic, not to be used, which meant his primary weapon was somewhere else entirely. The second man was the muscle, 6 feet 4 inches, 240 pounds, the kind of build that came from lifting heavy and hitting harder, undeniably former military from the haircut and bearing. His suit strained at the shoulders. His hands stayed loose at his sides in the ready position of a man prepared for close quarters work. On the inside of his right forearm, just visible beneath his cuff, Ilara caught the edge of a tattoo she'd seen before. The insignia of a specific Marine infantry unit, known for its brutal effectiveness. The third man was the technician, smaller, quieter, carrying a leather folder that would contain whatever paperwork they planned to use. Former law enforcement, perhaps, from the way he kept scanning the environment with the nervous awareness of someone trained to observe, but not to fight. 3 men, walking into a hospital in the dead of night. What would you do in that instant, realizing the wolf had just entered the fold, disguised as a shepherd? Ilara looked at the lead man's face and felt the ice-cold click of recognition. Not personal, but professional. She had seen his photograph in a classified briefing 6 years ago. A dishonorably discharged Special Forces operator from a storied unit, court-martialed for war crimes in a distant land. 3 years in a federal prison, now running a private military company. Silas Kane, corporate fixer, the kind of man who made problems disappear. He was here for her father. Kane approached the nurse's station with the measured confidence of a man who had done this countless times. He placed his credentials on the counter alongside a folder of documents bearing an official government letterhead. "Good evening, ma'am. Deputy Marshal Silas Kane." The smile was polished, practiced. "We have a federal court order to execute a protective transfer for Colonel Elias Vance. His testimony before the regulatory body has generated credible threats, and we've been ordered to move him to a secure facility in the capital for his safety." Ilara picked up the credentials, examining them. The forgeries were excellent, the kind of work that cost tens of thousands of dollars. But the behavioral tells were screaming. "I'll need to verify this with the attending physician," she said, her voice even. "Ma'am, this is a federal order." Kane's voice carried just enough authority to intimidate a civilian. "Time is a factor." "Sir, this is a hospital." Ilara met his gaze, perfectly steady, perfectly calm. "My patient isn't going anywhere until a doctor confirms he's medically stable for transport. Colonel Vance is 6 days post-triple bypass surgery. Moving him without medical clearance could kill him." While she spoke, her left hand, hidden below the counter, pressed the code silver button. The button was silent. It sent an alert to hospital security, local law enforcement, and the hospital's emergency management system simultaneously. It activated lockdown protocols on every floor. And it started a clock. An estimated 12 minutes until real law enforcement arrived. Kane saw something change in her eyes. Not fear. Something worse. "Your credentials are authentic," Ilara said, setting them back on the counter. "Your tactical formation isn't." The air in the corridor changed, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. "Excuse me?" Kane's polished facade began to crack. "Those are shooters' positions, not law enforcement escort formation. Your lead is positioned for breach, not protection. Your rear man is scanning for cameras, not threats." She paused. "And the big one has a Marine infantry tattoo, which means he's former military, not exactly a federal marshal." What would you do, having just revealed this depth of knowledge, knowing the consequences? Kane stared at her. The polished smile completely vanished. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the night shift nurse," Ilara said, "and you're not taking anyone off this ward." Ilara's internal clock began its relentless count. Kane's surprise quickly hardened into calculation. His quiet extraction was now a smash and grab. His eyes flickered to the east service corridor, the one with the disabled camera. The plan was clear. Get to Vance, take him, and escape through the pre-compromised route. If the nurse tried to stop them, she would be handled. He gave a sharp nod to his team. They drew weapons. The subtle glint of suppressed barrels in the fluorescent light was chilling, a stark punctuation mark in the escalating tension. Ilara stepped out from behind the nurse's station, positioning herself squarely in the corridor, between Kane's team and room 314. 3 armed former special operators with suppressed weapons, 1 nurse in scrubs. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood in their way. "Last chance," Kane said, his voice now a low growl, stripped of its false civility. "Step aside. You're 1 nurse against 3 armed professionals." "You have no idea what I am." Kane almost laughed. Almost. But something in her stance stopped him. The way her weight was perfectly distributed, her hands loose but ready, her eyes tracking all 3 of them simultaneously with the practiced ease of someone who had done room clearances in the most dangerous places on Earth. "Then educate me." "Your lead is former 5th Group, dishonorably discharged for war crimes. The big one is from a Marine Infantry unit, MOS 0311. She looked directly into Kane's eyes. "And you? You're carrying a suppressed SIG P226 with a 15-round magazine in a shoulder holster under your left arm, not on your belt where you put the display weapon. Your extraction vehicle is the black SUV in the visitor lot, engine running. You plan to take the patient through the East Service Corridor because you disabled the camera on that route 3 hours ago." The corridor went dead silent. The only sound was the steady, unwavering beep of the cardiac monitors in the surrounding rooms. "I'm giving you 1 chance to leave," Ilara said. "Take it." Kane's jaw tightened. He had spent 3 weeks gathering intelligence on every staff member in this unit. His file on the night shift had been thorough. Veteran nurse, former Army medic, honorable discharge, unremarkable service record. Nothing in that file explained how a civilian nurse had just given him a tactical assessment that would have impressed a JSOC intelligence analyst. But Kane was a man who solved problems with force, and force was what he knew. "Ree," he said, his voice flat. "Handle her." Dominic Ree stepped forward. 6 feet 4 inches, 240 pounds. Former Marine Infantry who had spent his post-service years working private security contracts in the Middle East. He had put down dozens of threats, bigger and more dangerous than a 140-pound night shift nurse. What happened next took 7 seconds. Ree closed the distance with a practiced grab, right hand reaching for her shoulder, left hand going for her throat. It was an efficient civilian control technique designed to immobilize and intimidate. Ilara moved the way water moves around a stone. She redirected his right hand past her shoulder, using his momentum to rotate his body, and locked his wrist in a joint manipulation that leveraged his own weight against him. The crack of his wrist breaking was sharp and precise. Before he could scream, she drove her palm into his solar plexus with enough force to empty his lungs, then completed the takedown with a knee strike to his thigh that dropped him to the floor. He was unconscious before his head hit the linoleum. 3 seconds. Tyler Webb, the forger, the technician, the man least prepared for violence, drew his weapon with hands that were already shaking. Ilara closed the gap before the barrel came up. She stripped the weapon from his grip with a disarm technique that would have made her Marine Corps martial arts instructor weep with pride, spun him face first into the wall, and used his own handcuffs, real ones, the one authentic piece of equipment they carried, to secure his wrists behind his back. 4 more seconds. 7 total. She turned to face Kane, holding Webb's weapon steady. The suppressed SIG on his belt, the display weapon, hadn't moved. He hadn't gone for the real weapon under his jacket. He was frozen, staring at his 2 operators, one unconscious, one handcuffed, and the woman who had neutralized them in the time it takes to tie a shoe. His mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. In 20 years of private military work in the back alleys of Kandahar, the corporate boardrooms of Manhattan, the dark corridors of problems that needed disappearing, Silas Kane had never seen anyone move like that. Not Delta, not Dev Group. Whoever this woman was, she was something his intelligence hadn't accounted for. And that failure was going to cost him the rest of his life. "Who?" Kane started. Ilara pressed the intercom button with her free hand. "Cipher 7 actual to any station monitoring this frequency." Her voice was calm, controlled, carrying the clipped precision of military communications protocol. "I have 3 hostile subjects at Apex Veterans Medical Center, Military Trauma Unit, 3rd floor. Subjects attempted unauthorized removal of a federal witness. 1 subject incapacitated, 1 restrained, 1 contained. Request immediate QRF support and federal law enforcement notification. Authorization code Omega 77 Bravo." Kane's face went white. That call sign, Cipher, wasn't in any database he could access. That authorization code was JSOC level, the kind of code that bypassed every chain of command and went straight to the Pentagon's crisis center. No civilian nurse had access to those codes. No former Army medic with an unremarkable service record could rattle off JSOC communications protocols from memory. His intelligence had been wrong. Catastrophically, fatally wrong. "On your knees," Ilara said, "hands behind your head. You know the position." Down the corridor, through the reinforced glass window of room 308, Sergeant First Class Javier Reyes watched, his mouth slightly agape. He was 34, former 75th Ranger Regiment, recovering from polytrauma sustained in an IED blast that had killed 2 members of his fire team. He knew what combat looked like. He knew what Tier 1 operators looked like. And what he saw in the corridor was not a nurse defending her patient. It was a phantom, moving with the brutal grace of a highly trained instrument, neutralizing threats to her principal. He understood, with the certainty of a man who had spent his career in the company of warriors, that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Silas Kane, faced with Ilara's chilling command, dropped to his knees. His hands went behind his head, a gesture of practiced compliance, not defeat. The fight had drained from him, replaced by a sudden, cold calculation of his own mortality. Dominic Rhee, the muscle, was still a heavy lump on the linoleum, unconscious. Tyler Webb, the technician, lay face down, wrists secured, whimpering softly about his rights. 3 trained professionals, neutralized by 1 night shift nurse in a matter of seconds. The silent beeping of the cardiac monitors in the ward seemed to mock Kane's meticulous planning. The phone at the nurse's station rang 90 seconds after Ilara's transmission. She answered it, Webb's weapon still trained steadily on Kane. "This is Apex Veterans Medical Center, Military Trauma Unit." The voice on the other end was measured, professional, carrying the unmistakable weight of someone operating from inside the Pentagon's National Military Command Center. "We are responding to a JSOC emergency activation. There's been a code transmission from your facility. We're trying to reach—" There was a pause, a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. "There's no name in the system, just a code designation." "This is Cipher," Ilara said quietly, her voice echoing the clipped precision of her earlier transmission. "Situation is contained. 3 private military contractors attempted to extract a federal witness, Colonel Elias Vance, United States Army, retired. The witness is secure. Subjects are controlled." "I need federal law enforcement response, not local. This is a corporate assassination attempt connected to an ongoing federal investigation into OmniPharma Industries." Another pause. Longer this time. "Copy, Cipher. Federal hostage rescue assets are being notified. The local field office will have agents on site within 15 minutes. A sigh, almost imperceptible. a human note in the detached military cadence. "It's good to hear your voice again, Master Sergeant." "Likewise," Ilara replied. "Cipher out." She set the phone down gently, the weapon remaining in her hand, its weight a familiar comfort. The corridor was quiet again, save for the distant wail of approaching sirens, barely audible through the thick hospital walls, and the steady, insistent beeping of cardiac monitors that had not missed a single beat throughout the entire confrontation. Then, Ilara heard another sound. Footsteps. Unsteady. The shuffled drag of a man who should not be out of bed, who was 6 days post-cardiac surgery, trailing wires from a portable monitor like the wounded tail of an animal. Colonel Elias Vance stood in the doorway of room 314. His face was gray with exertion, his hospital gown disheveled. His chest rose and fell with the labored breathing of a man whose heart had been cut open less than a week ago, whose body screamed for rest. But his eyes were sharp, clear. They were fixed on his daughter, the woman he had dismissed as just a nurse, the child he had accused of not being a real soldier. Now she stood in a hospital corridor, holding 3 armed men at gunpoint, with the cold professional composure of an operator who had done this 100 times in 100 places that would never appear in any history book. "Ilara." His voice cracked on her name, a fragile sound shattering the tension. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. Not while she had 3 potential threats in front of her. But her voice, when it came, carried the weight of 15 years. "Get back in bed, Colonel. You're 6 days post-cardiac surgery and you're going to throw a clot." "But how?" he began. "I'll explain later. Bed. Now." For the first time in his life, Colonel Elias Vance did exactly what his daughter told him. He turned and walked back into his room. But he didn't get into bed. He stood at the window, looking out at the city skyline, and felt the foundations of everything he believed about his daughter, everything he had said, everything he had assumed, every dismissive word he had spoken in the last 15 years, crumble like a building whose supports had been cut away. He didn't know what force reconnaissance was. He didn't know about the commendations she couldn't display. He didn't know about the dusty towns, or the desert canyons, or the hidden observation posts. He didn't know that his daughter had spent 18 years in the most elite reconnaissance unit in the Marine Corps. He didn't know that men who had earned the most respected designations spoke her call sign with quiet deference. All he knew was what he had just seen. A woman who could have been a general, who could have been anything, standing in a hospital corridor in nurses' scrubs, defending a man who had spent 15 years telling her she wasn't good enough. The tears came before he could stop them. Colonel Elias Vance, who hadn't cried since his own father's funeral decades ago, stood at the window of room 314 and wept. Down the hall, Marcus Cole, the hospital's security chief, a retired Army sergeant major, arrived on the 3rd floor with 3 security officers. He had been in his office when the code silver alert hit, and he had covered the distance to the elevator in a dead sprint that would have impressed a man half his age. What he found was a corridor under control. 3 subjects contained, 1 nurse holding a weapon with the steady, almost innate hands of someone born to it. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her for the first time in 6 years, and he nodded. A single, slow, deliberate acknowledgement. One warrior recognizing another. No surprise, no questions, just a deep, unspoken understanding. "Need me to take over?" Cole asked, his voice low and calm, cutting through the lingering tension. "Federal agents are 12 minutes out," Ilara replied, her voice still edged with the operational crispness that had only just receded. "I need these 3 separated and searched. The lead subject, Kane, may have secondary weapons. Check his left ankle and lower back." Cole didn't ask how she knew. He simply nodded again and began directing his team, their movements efficient, practiced. Ilara finally lowered the weapon. She placed it carefully on the nurse's station counter, safety engaged, barrel pointed towards the wall. Then, with the immediate threat contained, her focus snapped back to her patients. She checked the cardiac monitors on her station. Every patient stable, every vital sign within parameters. Even through a code silver, her ward had held. Because that's what she did. She kept people alive. The FBI arrived at 3:04 a.m., 11 minutes after Ilara's Pentagon call. Not local field agents on a routine response, but a team from the city's Joint Terrorism Task Force, redirected from a surveillance operation across town. They arrived expecting chaos. What they found was a quiet hospital corridor with 3 subjects secured, a security team maintaining a perimeter, and a night shift nurse calmly writing patient notes as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Special Agent Dana Morrison, the lead agent, a woman whose sharp eyes missed little, took Ilara's statement in the break room.
It lasted 45 minutes and covered the kind of operational details that made Morrison stop writing and simply listen.
"Your sealed file," Morrison said carefully, studying Ilara across the table, "is going to make the prosecution very interesting." "My file doesn't need to be opened," Ilara stated, her gaze steady. "Kane's team entered a hospital with weapons, forged credentials, and intent to kill a federal witness. You have 3 subjects in custody, forged documents, surveillance footage from every camera they didn't disable, and 16 witnesses who heard the code silver. You don't need my background. You need theirs." Morrison studied her, a flicker of something unreadable in her own eyes. "You've done this before." "I've done a lot of things." By 5 a.m., the FBI had removed Kane's team and begun the painstaking process of unraveling OmniPharma's conspiracy. The forged documents led to the document specialist who had created them. The specialist led to the OmniPharma executive who had authorized the operation. The executive's phone records led to a board meeting where 7 men and women had voted to resolve the Vance situation by any means necessary. Within hours, arrest warrants would be issued. Within days, Cardex, the deadly cardiac medication, would be pulled from every pharmacy in the country. Within weeks, the families of 23 dead veterans would learn that their loved ones hadn't died of heart failure. They had been killed by a drug company that valued its stock price over their lives. Walter Vance's testimony went forward at 7 a.m. as scheduled. Delivered from his hospital bed, an FBI agent standing guard outside the door, his daughter monitoring his cardiac function from the nurse's station. She watched his vitals on the remote monitor, adjusting nothing, intervening nowhere, because his heart, despite everything, held steady, stronger than it had been in weeks, as if the act of finally speaking the truth had given it a reason to keep beating. His voice was strong. His evidence was devastating. Internal memos, falsified trial data, bribery records, death certificates of 23 veterans whose cardiac events had been attributed to underlying conditions rather than the drug that killed them. OmniPharma's stock collapsed by market open. Criminal indictments would follow within the week. But the real resolution didn't happen in front of cameras or congressional committees. It happened at 7:47 a.m., when Ilara's shift ended, and she walked into room 314 for the last time. Vance was sitting up in bed. The color returned to his face, though whether from the adrenaline of his testimony or the emotion of the night, Ilara couldn't tell. The OmniPharma folder was closed on his bedside table. The testimony screen was dark. The room was quiet. She sat down in the chair beside his bed, the same chair where families sat, where wives held their husbands' hands, where children told their parents things that couldn't wait. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The cardiac monitor beeped steadily. Morning light angled through the window, painting gold across the floor. The same city sunrise that had greeted Ilara at the end of 1,000 night shifts. The same sun that didn't care about the distance between a father and a daughter, or the years they'd wasted being too proud to reach across it. Finally, Vance spoke. Force Reconnaissance, 18 years. Master Sergeant. Multiple deployments. Operations you still can't discuss. He was quiet again. Then, with the blunt honesty of a man who had stared at his own mortality twice in the same week, I told you that you weren't a real soldier. I was wrong. The silence stretched. Not the hostile silence of their 15-year estrangement. Something else. Something that felt like the space between the last round fired and the first breath of peace. I was proud, and I was ignorant, and I was afraid. Vance's voice cracked. Afraid you were better than me. Afraid you'd left me behind. Afraid that if I admitted what you'd become, I'd have to admit that everything I said to you was the worst thing a father could say to his child. Ilara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she checked his IV, adjusted his cardiac leads, noted his vital signs on the chart. The nurse's autopilot, giving her time to find the words she'd been carrying for 15 years. I didn't leave you, she said. You let go. Vance reached for her hand. His fingers were thin, bruised from IVs and blood draws. The hands of an old man who had once been strong enough to carry a rucksack through distant jungles for 30 days straight. Can you ever forgive me? She met his eyes, her pale gray-green meeting his faded blue. The same eyes, she realized. They'd always had the same eyes. I spent 15 years being angry at you, she said. I spent 6 years working in this unit, surrounded by fathers and sons and daughters who will never get to have this conversation because one of them is dead. And tonight, I almost lost you because I was too proud to take your admission. She paused, letting the weight of it settle. We're both still alive. That's more than a lot of families get. Maybe we should start there. Vance's hand closed around hers. She let him hold it. I'd like that, he said. They sat together in the morning light, father and daughter, and talked. Not about force reconnaissance or the distant jungle war or the 15 years of silence. They talked about small things. His garden at the house in Virginia, the tomatoes he'd been growing that nobody was watering while he was here, her apartment near the hospital, the single plant on the windowsill, the way she still drank her coffee black, the way he still couldn't sleep past 0500. Small things, but they were the threads, and if you pulled them carefully enough, you could weave them into something that held. Outside the room, Sergeant First Class Javier Reyes wheeled himself past the open door. He glanced inside, saw Ilara sitting beside her father, saw the old man holding her hand, and understood the scene the way only a soldier can. With the recognition that some battles aren't fought with weapons, and some victories aren't won by force. He caught Ilara's eye. She gave him a small nod. He returned it, one operator to another, and continued down the hall. Dr. Eris Vance found Ilara at the nurse's station 30 minutes later, finishing her shift notes with the same meticulous precision she brought to everything. The Pentagon's been calling, Vance said carefully. They want to know if you're, what was the word? Reactivatable. Ilara set down her pen. What did you tell them? I told them you're my best night shift nurse and they can't have you. Vance paused, a slight smile playing on her lips. But I also told them I finally understand why you're the best night shift nurse I've ever had. Ilara almost smiled. Almost. "I have a patient in room 314 who needs his cardiac medication adjusted," she said. "Can you put in the order?" "He's your father. He's my patient." She stood and gathered her things. "He's also my father, but right now he needs a doctor more than he needs a daughter." Vance nodded. "I'll adjust the medication."
And Alara, thank you for all of it. Every night you've worked here, every patient you've saved, everything we didn't know about. Alara picked up her bag and walked toward the elevator. At the end of the corridor, Private First Class Miller, the angry 22-year-old with no legs, was sitting in his wheelchair, staring at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. "Physical therapy," she said as she passed. 8 a.m. Be there." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he meant it. The elevator doors closed. Alara Thorne rode down 3 floors to the lobby, walked out into the heartland morning, and felt the sun on her face for the first time as someone whose 2 lives, the one she'd lived and the one she'd hidden, had finally become one. She drove to her apartment, a space of military-precise organization, no photographs on the walls, a single plant on the windowsill she'd kept alive for 6 years, proving something to herself she had only now begun to understand. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out her phone. For the first time in 15 years, she dialed a number she'd never deleted. It rang twice. "Hello?" Vance's voice, tired but alert. "It's me. I just wanted to make sure you took your medication." A pause, then softly. "I did, Alara." "Yeah. Will you come back tonight?" She closed her eyes, let the silence breathe. "I work every night, Dad." "I'll be there." She hung up, set the phone on the nightstand, looked at the single plant on her windowsill, still alive, still growing, still reaching toward the light. Then, Master Sergeant Alara Cipher Thorne, United States Marine Corps, retired, lay back on her bed, and did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She slept without dreaming. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen. Not celebrated, not praised, just seen. Seen for who they really are by the person whose eyes matter most. Alara Thorne spent 18 years serving her country in silence. She spent 6 more years serving its veterans in silence. She never asked for recognition. She never displayed her commendations. She never corrected the coworkers who thought she was a former Army medic, or the father who told her she wasn't a real soldier. But on one night, in a heartland city, in a hospital ward where broken warriors heal, the silence broke. And what emerged wasn't just a secret. It was a bridge between a father and a daughter, between what we expect our children to be and who they need to become, between the wars we fight with weapons and the wars we fight with forgiveness. Colonel Elias Vance learned something that night that changed him forever. Your children are never who you expected them to be. They're who they needed to become. And sometimes you have to witness their storm to understand their strength. The swift, precise machinery of justice, once set in motion, moved with an almost clinical detachment. By 5 a.m., the federal agents had vanished with Silas Kane's team. Their departure was as quiet as their arrival, leaving behind only the lingering scent of processed disinfectant and the faint metallic tang of latent adrenaline in the third-floor corridor. The forged documents, meticulously crafted yet ultimately flawed, led investigators directly to the specialist who had created them. That specialist, under federal scrutiny, led to the OmniPharma executive who had authorized the clandestine operation. The executive's phone records, a digital breadcrumb trail,
revealed a desperate board meeting where 7 powerful individuals had cast votes to resolve the Vance situation by any means necessary. The ripple effect was immediate and devastating for OmniPharma. Within hours, arrest warrants were issued for key figures. Within days, the deadly cardiac medication, Cardex, was systematically pulled from every pharmacy and medical facility across the country. And within weeks, the grim, unvarnished truth reached the families of 23 dead veterans. They learned that their loved ones had not simply succumbed to underlying cardiac conditions. They had been killed by a pharmaceutical company that valued its stock price above human lives, above the very soldiers who had given so much. The weight of that truth, for families and for the industry, was immeasurable. Colonel Elias Vance's testimony, the catalyst for this cascade of justice, went forward at 7 a.m. as scheduled. From his hospital bed, his voice, though tired, resonated with an unwavering resolve. An FBI agent stood guard outside his door, a silent sentinel, while Elara Thorne, from the nurse's station, monitored his cardiac function. She watched his vitals on the remote monitor, adjusting nothing, intervening nowhere. His heart, despite the trauma of the night and the recent surgery, held steady, stronger than it had been in weeks. It was as if the very act of finally speaking the truth, of bearing witness, had given it a renewed reason to beat. His evidence was devastating. Internal memos detailing the falsified trial data, meticulously recorded bribery payments, the harrowing death certificates of veterans whose cardiac events had been deliberately misattributed. OmniPharma's stock collapsed by market open, a financial implosion that mirrored the moral one. Criminal indictments would follow within the week, a cold, hard consequence for corporate greed. Yet the true resolution, the deeper reckoning, did not unfold in front of cameras or congressional committees. It happened at 7:47 a.m., when Ilara's shift finally ended. She walked into room 314 for what she knew would be her last official visit as his nurse. Elias Vance was sitting upright in bed. A fragile color returned to his face, though whether from the adrenaline of his testimony or the raw emotion of the night, Elara couldn't discern. The OmniPharma folder was closed on his bedside table, the FDA testimony screen dark. The room was quiet, devoid of the earlier tension, filled only with the soft, steady hum of the cardiac monitor. Elara sat down in the chair beside his bed, the same chair where families gathered, where wives held their husbands' hands, where children whispered confessions or hopes to their parents. Neither spoke for a long time. The cardiac monitor provided the only rhythm to the silence. Morning light angled through the window, painting gold across the hospital's sterile floor. The same sunrise that had greeted Elara at the end of 1,000 night shifts in this city. The same indifferent sun that did not care about the chasm between a father and a daughter, or the 15 years they had wasted, too proud to reach across it. Finally, Elias Vance broke the quiet, his voice raspy, thick with emotion. Force Reconnaissance, 18 years. Master Sergeant. Multiple deployments. Operations you still can't discuss. He fell silent again, letting the weight of the facts hang in the air, each word a revelation. Then, with the blunt, unsparing honesty of a man who had stared at his own mortality twice in the same week, he confessed, "I told you that you weren't a real soldier. I was wrong." The silence stretched, not the hostile, cutting silence of their 15-year estrangement, but something else. Something that felt like the quiet after a distant battle, the space between the last round fired and the first tentative breath of peace. "I was proud," he continued, his voice cracking. "And I was ignorant. And I was afraid." His eyes, now clear of the post-surgical haze, shimmered with unshed tears. Afraid you were better than me. Afraid you'd left me behind. Afraid that if I admitted what you'd become, I'd have to admit that everything I said to you was the worst thing a father could say to his child. What does it take for a hardened warrior, a man of command and unwavering conviction, to admit such profound vulnerability? The human cost of pride is often measured in lost years and unspoken words. Ilara didn't respond immediately. Instead, her hands moved on autopilot, checking his IV, adjusting his cardiac leads, noting his vital signs on the chart. The familiar, mundane acts of nursing provided a necessary buffer, giving her time to find the words she had carried, unspoken and heavy, for 15 years. "I didn't leave you," she said, her voice steady, without accusation. "You let go." Elias reached for her hand. His fingers, thin and bruised from IVs and blood draws, were the hands of an old man, once strong enough to carry a heavy rucksack through distant, unforgiving jungles for 30 days straight. "Can you ever forgive me?" She met his eyes, her pale gray-green meeting his faded blue. The same eyes, she realized. They had always had the same eyes. A common lineage, a shared intensity, finally visible. "I spent 15 years being angry at you," she said. "I spent 6 years working in this unit, surrounded by fathers and sons and daughters who will never get to have this conversation because one of them is dead. And tonight, I almost lost you because I was too proud to take your admission." She paused, letting the full weight of it settle in the sun-dappled room. "We're both still alive. That's more than a lot of families get. Maybe we should start there." Elias Vance's hand closed around hers, a fragile grip. She let him hold it. "I'd like that," he whispered. They sat together in the morning light, father and daughter, and talked. Not about the Marine Corps' elite reconnaissance unit, or the distant jungle war, or the 15 years of silence that had defined their relationship. They talked about small things, his garden at the house in Virginia, the heirloom tomatoes he'd been growing that no one was watering while he was hospitalized, her small apartment near the hospital, the single resilient plant on the windowsill, the way she still drank her coffee black, the way he still couldn't sleep past 0500. Small things, unassuming threads, but pulled carefully enough, they could be woven into something new, something that held. Outside the room, Sergeant First Class Javier Reyes wheeled himself past the open door. He glanced inside, saw Ilara sitting beside her father, saw the old man holding her hand, and understood the scene with the deep, quiet recognition that only a soldier can possess. Some battles aren't fought with weapons, and some victories aren't won by force. He caught Ilara's eye. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He returned it, one operator acknowledging another, and continued down the hall. Dr. Eris Vance, the attending physician, found Ilara at the nurse's station 30 minutes later, meticulously finishing her shift notes. "The Pentagon's been calling," Eris said, a cautious curiosity in her tone. "They want to know if you're, what was the word? Reactivatable." Ilara set down her pen, her gaze unwavering. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you're my best night shift nurse, and they can't have you." Eris allowed herself a slight, knowing smile. "But I also told them I finally understand why you're the best night shift nurse I've ever had." Ilara almost smiled in return. Almost. "I have a patient in room 314 who needs his cardiac medication adjusted," she said, her voice returning to its professional cadence. "Can you put in the order?" "He's your father," Eris prompted gently. He's my patient. Ilara stood, gathering her bag. He's also my father, but right now he needs a doctor more than he needs a daughter. Eris nodded, understanding. I'll adjust the medication. And Ilara, thank you for all of it. Every night you've worked here, every patient you've saved, everything we didn't know about. Ilara picked up her bag and walked toward the elevator. At the end of the corridor, Private First Class Miller, the angry 22-year-old with no legs, was sitting in his wheelchair. He stared at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, a flicker of something new. Respect, perhaps, or a nascent hope. Physical therapy, she said as she passed, her voice firm. 8 a.m. Be there. Yes, ma'am, he said, the bitterness gone, replaced by a clear, undeniable sincerity. He meant it. The elevator doors closed. Ilara Thorne rode down 3 floors to the lobby, walked out into the heartland morning, and felt the sun on her face for the first time as someone whose 2 distinct lives, the one she'd lived and the one she'd hidden, had finally, irrevocably merged. She drove to her apartment, a space of military-precise organization, no photographs on the walls, a single resilient plant on the windowsill she'd kept alive for 6 years, proving something to herself she had only now begun to truly understand. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out her phone. For the first time in 15 years, she dialed a number she'd never deleted. It rang twice. Hello, Elias Vance's voice, tired but alert, answered. It's me. I just wanted to make sure you took your medication. A pause, soft and meaningful, filled the silence. I did. Ilara. Yeah. Will you come back tonight? She closed her eyes, letting the quiet breathe. I work every night, Dad. I'll be there. She hung up, set the phone on the nightstand, looked at the single plant on her windowsill. Still alive, still growing, still reaching toward the light. Then, Master Sergeant Ilara Cipher Thorne, United States Marine Corps, retired, lay back on her bed, and did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She slept, without dreaming. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen. Not celebrated, not praised, just seen. Seen for who they really are, by the person whose eyes matter most. Ilara Thorne spent 18 years serving her country in silence, a phantom of war. She spent 6 more years serving its veterans in silence, a quiet guardian. She never asked for recognition, never displayed her commendations. She never corrected the coworkers who thought she was a former army medic, or the father who told her she wasn't a real soldier. But on one night in a heartland city, in a hospital ward where broken warriors found healing, the silence broke. And what emerged wasn't just a secret, it was a bridge. A fragile, hard-won bridge between a father and a daughter. Between what we expect our children to be and who they need to become. Between the wars we fight with weapons and the wars we fight with forgiveness. Colonel Elias Vance learned something that night that changed him forever. Your children are never merely who you expected them to be. They are who they needed to become. And sometimes, you have to witness their storm to truly understand their strength. If this story touched something in you tonight, if it reminded you of someone you haven't spoken to, a conversation you've been avoiding, a bridge you've been afraid to cross, maybe it's time. Because we're all still alive, and that's more than a lot of families get. Sometimes the quiet ones carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting the enemy in front of you, it's forgiving the one beside you. Before you go, let me say something real. Every day you show up, you watch, you care. And that's what makes this community different. If Ilara's story meant something to you, especially that moment when a father finally saw his daughter clearly, take 1 second and hit the like button. That tells me this story landed. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone you loved? I read every single one. If you're new here, welcome to the Angel Protocol. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and call your dad. I'll see you soon.